Hello and welcome to the video where we're going to be looking at this steampunk, well, I was going to say sculpture, but I guess it's more of a diorama really. It's grown somewhat since my original idea. I've always said that you should really pay as much attention to the base of a sculpture as you do the sculpture itself, but in this case I think I might have got a little bit carried away. Nevertheless, I do think it looks pretty cool and I'm really happy with how it came out. Obviously there's been a bit of a gap between the previous video and this one, and it's just really a consequence of the pieces I'm making these days, I think, in that as the level of complexity goes up for all these things and the distance between videos increases, I might try and find some simpler, smaller projects to do perhaps, just to increase video production, but it's just a trade-off between the two, unfortunately. I did also get a little bit distracted and started working on the next project before I finished this one, so this thing will feature in videos in the future. Yeah, that's one of the dangers of having everything blue tacked together. So I'll go into more detail about exactly what this is in future videos, but as you can see I've started working on the next thing, so that's going to be coming up. But it's just one of those things, I've kind of got too many ideas and not enough time, so I try and fit these things in as much as I can, and I'm getting into a position now where I start things before I finish the previous one, so it's just the way these things sort of go. But anyway, that will be coming up soon. So in this video I'm largely going to be looking at painting this piece and putting the last few finishing touches to it, so let's get started. So the first thing I wanted to pay attention to is this face, which is going to be part of the background of the piece. I try not to do sort of subtext and meaning in my pieces because I don't really consider them art. I sort of consider them more craft than anything. But I sort of did have a general idea of what this piece was sort of, not exactly trying to say, but a sort of a thought process as to why these things are where they are. And I wanted to have a situation where it was like the steampunk was sort of taking over the building. And so I wanted this face to be a sort of a looming presence behind the character. Maybe to sort of represent steampunk or some sort of mechanical sort of influence in the piece. I mean, you could literally take it as being some sort of robot or artificial intelligence or something like that, I suppose, but I just wanted to imply that there was sort of some sort of malevolent force. So to that end, I want to make this face look quite steampunk, and so I want to add some additional detail to it, some rivets and some panel lines and things like that, and some additional mechanical bits just to sort of give it that look. I'm then going to be painting it up with some copper paints to give it a nice sort of an industrial look. So a good way I found to do panel lines is actually to sketch them in pencil first. That way you can just get a sort of a general idea of how they're going to look. What I tend to do is use a piece of plastic which can curve around the contours of the piece. Once I've got something that I'm relatively happy with, I can then start scratching in the design. I have a Tamiya panel line scriber, which is quite good, but you can just use a blunted scalpel blade as well. So I tend to use a combination of the two. What I also want to do is put a sort of mechanical junction in the head. So I'm going to use this Forstner bit to drill a hole and create a sort of an aperture for where that can sit. This was creating a hell of a mess, so I decided to use my dust collector here. It's just actually a lampshade, which I've put a sort of an attachment on the bottom, and that can then fit into the pipe there, which is connected to my dust extractor. Okay, so with the coat of undercoat, you can see how that's looking, so I think that's looking pretty good. So what I want to do is actually add some rivets to this as well, and way back when I did a sort of mechanical head sculpture, it was actually the first series of videos I did on the channel some time back. And the way I did the rivets on that occasion was to actually push into the clay with the sculpting tool to create some indentations, and that's all worked well enough, but you know, real rivets actually come out of the surface rather than go in. So I wanted to do that, so what I'm going to do is drill a series of holes and then put some sewing pins into the holes, and the caps of these look really good as rivets, so this will take a while, but it should give quite a nice effect once it's done. Right, so there we go. So I think that's looking pretty good, and as you can see I've put another brass sort of conduit bit in there as well. So what I'm going to do is just start painting this up with some copper paints, and I'm using some Games Workshop Citadel paints for this. And with metallic finishes like this, what I've found is that using a variety of different shades really adds something and sort of helps it look like a real metallic piece. So that's what I'm going to do here. I'm going to give it a base coat of one colour, and I'm going to come in with some highlights and sort of try and vary up the colour a bit, just to give it a more realistic look. Okay, so that's not looking too bad, but what I also want to do is vary the colour even further and add some shading with the airbrush. So I'm just coming in and airbrushing some black into the recesses of sculpture, just to create some shading. What I'm also going to do is a technique that I've used on several builds previously, and that's to mask off some of the panel lines and then just to airbrush along the sides. What that does is just help give some variance to the edges of the panels. It really helps break up the surface detail of the sculpture. Okay, so there we go. So I think that's looking pretty good. As you can see, there's a fair amount of variance in the colour of the piece, and there's a bit of shading in there as well. So now that's done, I can now come in and sort of do my favourite thing, which is sort of the thing I've been looking forward to doing for quite a while, and that is to actually add some verdigris corrosion into the piece. And to do this, what I'm doing is using oil paints. In this case, I'm using Absalom 502 oil paints. And I think I've mentioned before that these are intended specifically for models, so they have less oil in them than regular oil paints, and that's because they're intended to be used on like plastic surfaces, whereas regular oil paints are used on canvas, and of course that's going to soak up some of the oil. So these things were intended for this purpose, and I just really like the range of colours they've got. They're really easy to use and you can get some lovely looks with these, so they're sort of my favourite thing to use when it comes to doing some washes and shading. So what I'm going to do is add some verdigris colours into the details of the piece and just try and give it a nice weathered, corroded look. I'm using some white spirit to cause these to run and sort of use them as a wash, and I'm just using a cotton bud to move those around. I really do love doing this sort of paint job, so I need to be careful not to go too crazy with it. But I think I've sort of struck the right balance here of getting some corrosion in there but not overwhelming the sculpture with colour. Now for the face of the sculpture, this is a slightly different process for me. Previously, when I've done sculptures like this, I've often used the flesh coloured Super Sculpey to do the face. That way I can just use the colour of the Sculpey for the skin, and usually a bit of red on top of that really sort of brings things to life. So you don't really need to do too much to those sorts of things, and you may remember from way back when this Tywin Lannister sculpture that I did, and the Super Sculpey really did most of the work for me, so that was really, really good. I have had a go at painting flesh tones from scratch, and here's one from the previous sculpture. So I sort of know what I'm doing. Nevertheless, this sort of thing is always a bit of a challenge, so I'm approaching this with a bit of trepidation. But what I'm doing here is just giving it a flesh coloured base, which I can paint over. Now for the hair, I'm painting a brown base coat, but I'm going to come in with some orange to airbrush over to try and give it a sort of a ginger hair colour, a bit like the picture that I used for inspiration right at the beginning of this. It's always a bit of a challenge using the airbrush with things this small. I tend to get quite a lot of overspray, but I think that's looking okay. I can always come back in and recorrect a bit later on. So now coming in with some red oil paints and trying to add some colour to the flesh to kind of give it a bit more variety and make it look a little bit more alive. It can be quite difficult with this. It's quite a subtle thing. If you put too much on, it just looks like it's wearing loads of makeup. If you don't have enough, it sort of looks a bit lifeless and dead. So it's a bit of a subtle art with this. Particularly with female characters, you tend to want to kind of give them a little bit of a makeup look, which again is a skill unto of itself. So not something I'm super experienced with really. So I'm sort of trying to find my way with this as I go. Now about halfway through I realised I'd made a bit of a mistake with this. Because the flesh colour I was using was a little bit too strong, I tried to bring it down a little bit with some white paint, but the paint I used had a gloss finish. So as you can see, the face is actually quite shiny and it doesn't look particularly realistic. So I persevered with this for a while, hoping I could pull it off, but after a while I realised that this wasn't really going to work. So in the end I decided to actually wipe the paint off and start again. So this is what I came up with afterwards, and it's exactly the same process really. I just used some slightly different paints that didn't have a gloss finish, and what I also did was to come in with some oil paints, some flesh coloured oil paints, and added those on too to try and matte down the colour a little bit. Now on its own the head doesn't look a little bit too pale, but in situ I think it really works quite well. So yeah, it's a bit of a learning curve with this really. I think the original paint job I did was okay, just a little bit too shiny, so you know, I think you just kind of need to know when to quit with this sort of stuff. So although it's a bit scary, I decided to wipe off the paint job and start again. Now for the clothing, I came in straight away with a really bright colour, and the reason I did that is because I had the AI image that I used as inspiration for this piece, and that's got quite bright clothing, so I thought I'm just going to do exactly what I see in the photo. But once I started doing this, I realised actually this isn't really going to work. It just looks a little bit too, I don't know, cartoony and artificial perhaps. So I had an initial go at this, but ultimately, as with the face, I decided that this wasn't the way to go, so I ended up changing my mind halfway through. So as you can see, I'm trying to remove the paint here, although this stuff was actually quite tough and it didn't really want to come off, so I just ended up painting over it. But what I decided to do in the end was to use some much more muted colours. So what I'm doing here is to airbrush on some Tamiya paints, which generally don't tend to be too saturated. What I then did, once I had a base coat, was come in with some oil paints and paint over the acrylic with the oils. The advantage of that was that I could sort of feather them out a little bit, make them a little bit more subtle than the paint job I had originally. And the other cool thing was that if I didn't like it, I could just wipe them straight off with some white spirit. So this was quite a nice way of sort of feeling my way through the paint scheme and trying to get to where I wanted to get. But still being able to roll back from it if I really needed to. I think part of the problem with this was that because the piece is fairly large, it's got some large areas, particularly on the skirt, which are kind of just large blank areas with no detail. And so because of that, you kind of need to make the paint job detailed in order to fill in those flat surfaces. So I was trying to get a variation in colour and do some shading and so forth with the paint to try and bring those shapes to life. And so that was something I struggled with quite a lot. But as you can see, adding the oils here is really slowly sort of bringing the shape to life a little bit, I think. And so that ultimately turned out the way to go, although it took me a while to actually hone in on the exact colour scheme that I wanted to use. And similarly with breaking up large undetailed shapes for the legs, I decided to do some stripes on the trousers just to give that a bit more visual detail. And what I'm using here is some very thin Tamiya masking tape, and this stuff worked really well. I still had some clean up where some paint leaked through underneath, but this made the job pretty easy. Now for the boots, there's plenty of detail on here already, so these were a little bit easier to paint. Nevertheless, I did find myself adding several different browns on these, because again, there is still some fairly large sections like on the sides and the back which are relatively undetailed. So I found myself sort of dabbing on lots of different shades of brown just to give some natural variation, and then doing some washes of oil on top of that to try and tie everything together. So for the base, I wanted this to be white, and so I'm giving it a white base coat. I mostly used Tamiya enamels for this, although they were quite thin and I found them running quite a lot, so initially I was thinking that I'd already ruined this on the very first pass because I was getting all this paint dripping down and so forth. But I persevered, and once I got enough coats of white on it, it started looking okay. So what I'm doing now is coming in and adding some variation. So I bought a load of Tamiya colours which are sort of off-whites, there's various like buff stone I think was one, and what I'm doing is airbrushing on to the piece using a piece of plastic to mask off some of the brickwork. So what I'm really doing here is just trying to add in some variation in the colour scheme to try and again break up these flat surfaces. Now what I wanted to try was to do some marble effect. I'd had a go at this on a Games Workshop model a while back, and I got some quite nice results, so I thought this might be a cool thing to add to the model, because again I've got some, this column here for example is quite a large bare surface really, so I wanted to add some visual detail to it, and I thought a marble effect might be a quite nice way of doing that. However, again, with the other pieces of the paint scheme that I tried, I didn't really think this was working. It didn't look particularly marbly to me, and I think perhaps doing it at a larger scale wasn't really working in my favour. It worked quite well on a Games Workshop robot, but in this one wasn't really feeling it, so I decided to abandon that after a while, and luckily, because I painted over lacquers with acrylic, I could just wipe that off with some isopropyl alcohol. So it was an easy mistake to correct. But once I put some base colours down, I could then come in and start doing the fun stuff, which is like weathering it up. So what I'm doing here is using some oil washes to add some dirt and grime to the model. And once I'd done this, it really started adding some life to the piece. As you can see, this is all dripping down, and that's just because the brush is saturated with white spirit. But the drips really just added some realism to it. It really started looking like stone that had been out of the elements for a long time and had been rained on incessantly. So once I added this on, it really started bringing the piece together, and it started looking quite realistic, so I was really happy with that. And once I'd done that, I sort of felt like I'd figured out the paint scheme, and so that gave me a fair degree of confidence to continue. So all I'm doing is just adding oils which are watered down with mineral spirits and white spirit, and then I'm just wiping it off with a cloth. So as I mentioned before with the large face, I wanted it to seem as though the steampunk was sort of taking over the tower. So to that end, what I've done is to make these sort of, I don't know what they are, sort of clamp things that I want to add to the base of the sculpture. So I want it to seem as though the steampunk elements have been clamped onto the structure, and they're sort of taking it over. So I've got some copper sort of mechanical items here which I'm going to glue to the base of the structure. And with those in place, I can then start having a go at one of my favourite things, as I mentioned, which is to weather these up with some more verdigris colours. So I really found these added something to it, adding some variation in colour, some additional weathering to the piece really sort of added something. And this sort of thing's always great fun to do, so I had a great time adding all this stuff in. So there you go, as you can see, I've sort of streaked it up the model. I'm not quite sure if that's accurate really, because the corrosion's going up, but you do see sort of accretions of sediment from drips. Is it stalagmites, the one that grows to the floor, you know? So this is a similar idea here, that the copper on the stone has sort of slowly migrated upwards as the rain has hit it. I don't know if that's accurate or not, but it looks kind of cool, so we'll run with it. But I think this was really useful in just adding some additional colours into the brickwork. So in addition to the face, I want to add some additional mechanical bits on here, and then we've got the giant ring here, which I did paint off camera, but that was the same process as the face, just lots of metallic colours. Took quite a while, obviously there's quite a lot of detail on it. But what I want to do is add these copper pipes in place. So I've made some resin pipe holders just to attach them to the surface, so I'm just going to glue these in place. And I'm also adding some additional verdigris streaking down the brickwork. Something I also wanted to do was use some of my skulls, which I've made for previous projects. There's some large sort of blank spaces on the sides of the base, so I wanted something to break those surfaces up. So I thought a little copper mural might be cool to have on the side, and of course it just gives me some additional opportunities to do some more verdigris weathering, so I couldn't really pass that up. So there it is in place, and I'm just streaking down some more colours to give that effect. Right, so there we go. This is probably the most complicated project I think I've ever made. I've often said that you should pay as much attention to the base of a sculpture as you do the sculpture itself. I think in this case I've got a bit carried away because the base is way more complicated than the actual sculpture itself. Nevertheless, I do think it adds quite a lot to it, so I'm quite happy with it. If you've made it this far, thanks very much for watching. There'll be more to come on sculptures like this, but for the time being that's it. So thanks very much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Thanks very much for watching. I'll be posting videos on future projects, so if you'd like to keep up with what's going on, please do subscribe. Alternatively, you can visit my website, which is www.thedarkpower.com, or you can find me on Facebook, just search for The Dark Power.